Hey everyone, Owen here. Just got back from my local Turning Point USA chapter meeting, and today I want to talk about unions, that thing your uncle has a really strong opinion about for everything except the police. Now, unions have been a massive part of labor movements across the world for over the last nearly century and a half, and have had an incalculable effect on the way we see and experience work today, giving us more humane work weeks and hours, more standard pay and benefits, and motivating even more broad political reform like the American New Deal. So much of what we think of as just a natural part of how work, works is the product of very hard-fought battles by these kinds of labor organizations. Now, if you're even a little bit tuned in to what's going on in the games industry today, you'll probably have at least heard of the possibility of unionization within it, most likely in the context of talk about the increasingly common practice of development crunch. That is, large amounts of unpaid overtime leading up to the release of a game, massive employee layoffs at major development studios as their executives receive large bonuses, and any number of other instances of unfair or exploitative behavior from publishers or studios. And grouping these various things when discussing unions isn't at all a stretch. It's definitely arguable that those factors are playing a really major role in pushing the industry towards unionization, and it's brought labor issues into conversations that they normally wouldn't be present in, namely those with gamers. It's been very easy for a long time to ignore the fact that there are people behind these products, and that's created a very weird culture. It feels like, to some people, things like a game getting delayed are indicative of some catastrophic disaster. Kirby and the Amazing Mirror got delayed. Fuck, did we lose a war? No one really seems to ever think very much about what developers have to go through to get a game with no problems out on time, much less one with development challenges, so it's a good sign that these conversations are becoming more and more common. That said though, I'm not really here to talk about what's going on today or where it's going in the future. What I want to do is look back. To be clear, I do think 100% that unions would be a good thing for the industry and its workers, and is a necessary means of stopping the staggering amounts of exploitation taking place in it today. But I feel like that one present argument, whether or not unions and collective action are viable in the industry today and going forward, is all that's ever really talked about when the subject comes up, and I want to do something different. If you're interested in that side of things, Super Bunny Hop has probably the best video on the subject. It's incredibly well researched and insightful, and I'll link it below, so check it out if you're interested. After you watched this well researched, incredibly insightful video first, of course. Now, even though I literally just said I'm not going to be talking about economic theory or anything like that in broad terms, I can already tell that I'm going to have people in my comments saying, "Don't you know, people in the industry are paid proportionally to their work. Nothing's stopping you from becoming a game CEO, which, whoa, who knew it was this easy? The trick is working 100,000 times harder than everybody else. Now I get to live out my dream of making Super Mario Super Sluggers 2. Try to remember that trick next time you're unemployed." But back to what we're doing today. Despite hearing so much about unions and games development today and in the future, it's rarely, if ever, that I hear anyone talking about the history of labor and unions in the industry. And that's in large part because unions, in their modern sense, have been a rarity until and including today relative to other entertainment industries. Labor in the games industry has a very interesting and eventful history that we almost never get to hear anything about. While it's good to think and argue about where we are today, it's also a really important thing to take the time to see where we've been, what's been done, and what we can learn from it. To start, we're jumping back probably further than you would expect, all the way to 1988, with the founding of the Game Developers Conference, or as it was called at the time, the Computer Game Developers Conference. That same year, EA hosted an event called the Artists Symposium, meant to bring the company's developers together over a 2-day period for collaboration and, well, just being together, since that was an uncommon thing for the company. At the time, if you'll believe it, EA actually had the reputation of being at least somewhat, well, acknowledging of the existence of their developers, referring to them as artists, which was a sentiment ahead of its time in much of the industry. However, this event took a bit of a sour turn, at least in the eyes of EA founder Trip Hawkins. See, and this is just a business tip from me to you, but if you're not always forming exactly fair contracts with your employees, it may not be the best idea to get them all in one place for too long. Hawkins clearly didn't learn that in his strategy degree, however, because he did exactly that, and it went exactly how you would expect it would. As designer Ernest Adams explained in an interview with The Escapist in 2007, the Artist Symposium was a big success and the first time that any developers had come together in a group, pretty much anywhere. I believe they held 2 of them. However, eventually the developers began comparing notes on their contracts and royalty rates, and those who were getting less than the others began to object. Tripp says he wasn't going to fund an event that enabled his developers to band together against him, so there were no more artist symposiums. Oops. But all hope was not lost. With the symposium shut down and That's how speedrunning Reddit got back at me. I'm sorry guys, I know I haven't speedrun anything. I know! I'm allowed to talk about racism without being really good at Mario 64, okay? But all hope was not lost. With the symposium shut down, an EA artist named Chris Crawford decided to host his own event, this one in his own home in San Jose. The gathering, while only getting 26 people, was a massive success relative to what it set out to be, only looking for 15 or so. As Adams continued in that same interview, 26 people showed up, and it was so successful that he decided to set up a company and put on a proper conference in a hotel. That was 1988, and that was the founding of the Computer Game Developers Conference. While the conference was an important step and continues to be a great meeting place and resource for developers, it fell short of being an actual mechanism for developer advocacy, a problem that came to a head 5 years later during the US congressional hearings on game content. These hearings, as well as a generally increased amount of legislation surrounding games at the time, presented a threat to Ernest Adams, at this point an employee at the CGDC, who thought that the industry workers needed a more direct form of self-advocacy. After some convincing, the conference board allowed Adams to form a new department under them called the Computer Game Developers Association, or as we know it today, the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA. With the intention of creating a true professional association to give game developers a voice and a way to come together to advance the state of the art, Adams' new department was one of the first such associations available to workers in the games industry. Now, I want to be clear here. The IGDA was not and is not a union. While their mission statement since 2017 has been that IGDA supports and empowers game developers around the world in achieving fulfilling and sustainable careers, and Ernest Adams said that its primary function was and is to support the careers and interests of developers as individuals, not companies, it was also made explicitly clear from inception that the association was not a trade union due to the relatively minor importance of labor issues in the industry at the time. But even in recent years, when those issues were much more at the forefront of our conversations, and when actual unions were beginning to involve themselves in games, then Executive Director Jen McLean said in an interview with Kotaku's Jason Schreier that, to assume that suddenly, if you unionize, everything will be great, I don't think that is a reasonable assumption. And I do think we have to have these conversations about what does unionizing studio by studio mean. Going on to further explain a generally cautious stance towards unionization. In another interview with US Gamer, she said of crunch time that, "The other problem is that there are people who are happy to make the trade-off to work those hours and at the end of the shipping of their game get a bonus that is 1, 2, 3 times their annual salary."
Yeah, sure. Here at Realm Studios, we grossly underpay our employees, which is technically a crime, but I'm sure that these people are happy to be making nearly half of the Ohio minimum wage. That's $4 more than they would be making unemployed.
But even though the IGDA has played a limited role in unions themselves, we can see with its creation the beginnings of what would become a constantly developing labor movement in the games industry. In subsequent years, we would see a lot of much smaller movements, and some of the very first self-described unions for industry workers. Notable among these was UB Free, a self-proclaimed union founded online by disgruntled French Ubisoft employees in late 1998, after the publication Liberation published statements from the Guillemot brothers, founders of the company, expressing their feelings that traditional labor and employee support structures were unnecessary at the studio.
Guillemot. Thanks, Google Translate. I'm sure that's the way the French would say it. Okay.
Motivated by generally exploitative labor practices and this apparent complete disregard for the well-being of Ubisoft's employees, the intent of UB Free was to force the hand of the Guillemot brothers towards addressing these conditions. While it began informally with the group of employees collecting statements from their colleagues, the project soon expanded into a website where workers could easily make anonymous posts about their experiences with the company and became an immediate success with a large amount of traffic and posts. But, as some of the site's founders told Liberation in a mid-1999 follow-up piece, management did not take kindly to the site and immediately attempted to stop it, first by briefly blocking the site itself, and soon after by pressuring the site hosts to hand over information on its creators and to stop hosting it, but requests were denied. Despite this early hostility, some changes were actually made. While only 5 days of meetings with management actually happened, within 3 months the action resulted in Ubisoft putting an end to its various kinds of expected overtime and also added HR personnel to their staff. However, the founders of UB Free only saw this as a partial success. One concession offered by Ubisoft management that I didn't mention was the election of employee representatives, and that's because they didn't happen, in large part because nobody showed up. The explanation for this that the organizers gave was a low amount of worker involvement or support beyond the anonymous message board, something motivated by the internal work culture that isolated employees, a fear of retaliation from management, and a general lack of critical support from the outside that would allow those employees to feel more secure in taking action. While UB Free would ultimately only prove to be a minor improvement for the studio, it would be one of the first examples of more localized and specific efforts for better conditions in the industry, something that would become more popular with increasing accessibility to the internet. While not real, organized movements in themselves, the 2000s and early 2010s would see a number of blogs and open letters from the spouses of industry workers, one of the first of these being EA Spouse, also known as EA The Human Story, originally created on LiveJournal in 2004. While the post mostly focuses on the specific experience of the author and their significant other, which included routine and extended crunch time, and the adverse health effects caused by it, the consolidation of the industry job market into a few major players, a process that involved foul play and actively anti-competitive practices that stifled smaller studios, and a general disregard for employee safety from those in executive positions, it got a massive response from other industry workers and their families and regular consumers of games. It's actually a really cool thread to read. It's clear that the story influenced the feelings of a lot of people on labor issues in games and in general, and you can even see pretty extensive conversation about unionization over a decade before we'd ever see any tangible result of that movement. That combined with the fact that the main post includes passages about EA and their product that could have been written last week, and the whole thing has a very relevant feel to it. EA Spouse will be followed up by a few other similar letters, notably Rockstar Spouse in 2010 and 38 Studios Spouse in 2012, both originally published by Gamasutra. Both similarly discussed cases of serious mismanagement, worker exploitation, stripping back of benefits, and the emotional and physical consequences for those workers and their families. And much like EA Spouse before them, they would be very influential in conversations about labor in the games industry. 4 years after EA Spouse, 2008 would see the creation of the site Game Quality of Life, an academic research project to study issues of quality of life and working conditions in the digital game industry, which has since become one of the best documented resources on conditions and collective action in games development. It was actually a really important resource while researching this video, though it does tend to focus a bit on the West. GameQOL has also partnered with the IGDA to administer the Developer Quality of Life and Developer Satisfaction Surveys, which not only direct IGDA policy, but also give the wider public a better idea of conditions within the industry. Questions about unionization have both furthered the issue and given a clearer idea of the general support for it among workers. In 2010, another attempt at better conditions within Ubisoft would be attempted, this time with the site UbiFree 2.0, an obvious successor to the earlier 1998 version. While this site didn't get anywhere near the same amount of traffic or support as even the already under-supported original UbiFree, it again provided an extensive documentation of the company's practices and disregard for its workers. And again, while a lot of these sites and blogs never actually ended in any real action or any serious attempts at unionization, they're very clearly important to pushing the industry to the point where that could actually happen. Where we are today didn't come out of nowhere, it's the direct result of the efforts of these groups and individuals fighting for decades before we would even be able to see the beginning of what they were fighting for. From 2016 to 2017, a group we haven't really talked about yet would take a stand against the games industry, this being the video game voice actors and their parent union, SAG-AFTRA. Negotiations between the union and various industry employers had been underway since 2015, focusing on demands for secondary compensation, the practice of giving additional or residual pay to developers after a game crossed a certain sales milestone, something given to developers but not other kinds of employees such as voice actors, increased transparency and engagement from employers, and the right for actors to get more information on the games they're working on, even things as basic as what their role actually is. At the time, however, the contract the industry was working off of had been in use since 1994 and had remained virtually unchanged since then. Nothing in the games industry should be allowed to remain virtually unchanged since 1994. Bubsy 2 came out that year. As the union said, it's time for video game employers to take our concerns seriously and negotiate a modern contract based on actor safety, industry precedent, and best practices. But during these negotiations, the other parties were largely unresponsive and dismissive. When SAG-AFTRA asked for better precautions for vocal safety, they offered to put more tea and water in the booths for the actors, something they already do, and this doesn't resolve the issue or protect the actors. So, in 2016, the union voted overwhelmingly to go on strike against 11 companies, including Activision, Disney, EA, and Insomniac. The strike went on for nearly 11 months, with other actor and labor unions providing support throughout, both online and in person, and it finally came to an end in late 2017. And while the union didn't get the concessions they wanted on residual pay, they did get commitments to greater transparency and better overall pay. Now, I know it might seem that this strike is different from the other things we've been talking about today because it's not about game developers, but I think that might be the wrong way to think about it. I mean, what really separates developers from voice actors, or quality assurance, or artists, or anyone else anywhere in the process of game production and development? Sure, they've all got very radically different roles in that process, but all of these people make games as much as the people doing the coding. And this is a moment in history when the people who make games took serious action to advocate for themselves, and it worked. Yeah, we've had successes already, but the kind of mass action with solidarity between workers, studios, even industries that we saw here is something we haven't really seen yet, and that's really cool and important in an industry where collective action is rare and success even more so. In subsequent years, we would only see more and more of this kind of action. Late 2017 would also see the formation of the Syndicate of Video Game Workers in France, a union that aims to constitute a friendship, solidarity, and defense pact between all workers of the video games industry.
God, the French know how to make something sound awesome.
And within a very short time after the Syndicate's formation, they would already be involved in an industry fight. In early 2018, a strike would begin at the French studio Eugen Systems after studio management failed to deliver on promised back pay. Though the Eugen employees didn't have a union themselves, they were offered support by the Syndicate in the form of representation and distribution of statements on top of their main action plan of appealing to the media and politicians. While the strike only lasted a bit over a month and didn't end in anything substantial, the workers with union support continued to fight the studio through legal channels. Other smaller strikes of this kind were going on at the same time and would keep happening, such as the Riot Games walkout in 2019 over toxic work environments and a refusal from management to address the concerns raised by their employees, part of a much wider reckoning with culture and accountability in the industry at the time. We've focused a lot today on the West, but let's at least take a moment to turn our attention elsewhere, specifically to South Korea in 2018. That year, Nexon, publisher most notably of MapleStory, got a union of its own, the first of the industry in South Korea, with the goal of acting as a tow truck to improve labor conditions in the gaming industry as a whole. Unlike most other company-specific union formations we've discussed, there wasn't really any immediate backlash from management, having actually released a statement saying they would respect it. But that didn't stop any conflict from arising, with a strike being called in late 2019 over the company's lack of job security due to regular shakeups in the organization, something sadly not unique to Nexon. Though this did fail to result in any major revision to policy, earlier this year the union did manage to negotiate for a wage increase of 6.8%. But one of the most significant developments in the entire history of the game industry's labor movement would come in 2018, just a few weeks after that year's Game Developers Conference, one marked by union-centric discussions and programming. A movement to finally broadly unionize the industry, having started earlier that year online, first on Facebook and later on Discord, and expanding industry during the conference, this would become Game Workers Unite, one of, if not the most popularly supported efforts for collective action among industry workers to date, quickly gaining thousands of members and establishing a number of chapters across the United States and beyond, with their UK chapter notably being the first of its kind in the country. They've collaborated with other game workers unions such as the aforementioned STJV in France, Bec2 Game Workers in Scotland, and Game Makers Finland, and as well as other labor unions such as the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guild of America for direction and strategy, and the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain to set up chapters in their country. Much like many other unions, Game Workers Unite doesn't really have a leader, which, to be clear, I think is a good thing. But they do have Emma Kinema, co-founder and most public member of the union, and I wanted to bring her up because of, well, who she is. See, she's not a game developer, and she doesn't work on games in the way most people think about it. She worked in quality assurance, one of the industry's most thankless positions both from the inside and out. And I want to note that because, like I said earlier, the process of making games is way more broad than we often think about it, and even though we always hear about crunch and bad working environments for programmers and artists, all of these people have to deal with that stuff, and consequently, labor movements have to account for this broad range of people and roles to really be effective in the games industry, so Game Workers Unite being already reflective of that was and is pretty big. While the union is still very young and has only supported relatively minor actions so far, it's already shaping up to be the future of labor in games development and the driving force for the extension of opportunities like it to as many game industry workers as possible. And despite some controversies, I'm very excited for the future that Game Workers Unite seems to be indicative of, and I'm very excited to see a more collective and politically active workforce in games. And as time goes on, the movement to widely organize the games industry has just continued to expand and accelerate. Just this year, we saw the Communication Workers of America launch CODE, the Campaign to Organize Digital Employees, a program that aims to support and direct the formation of unions in a number of industries, games included. And even many already existing unions in specific areas or companies have, as secondary goals, the expansion of unionization to others in the industry. Even many places without broad unionization have other labor groups that will provide support and solidarity to workers who want to organize, making the option, while not without risk, much safer than it was just 10 years ago. The progress that's been made is inspiring, to be honest, and it's important to remember that, even though the fight for unionization is ongoing, and the victories necessary to make the games industry a safe, secure, and viable place to work have yet to be won, the history of unionization and collective action in it is a story with a lot of successes. And I think it's important to be hopeful. But again, it's nowhere near a finished process, and if you're in the industry and want to unionize but don't know how or where to start, I really would encourage you to look into some of these groups and resources that we discussed, all of which are linked in the description. And if you're not in the industry, still maybe do that. Look for ways that you can support local efforts for unionization, learn about the issues important to industry workers, and maybe even look into what unions are doing and how to help if you have the resources. If you want to see things change, this is how you do it. The future of labor in the games industry is promising, for sure, but it's never going to be guaranteed.
Please buy my game, only $89.99, and I can guarantee that at least $3 of those dollars will be going to my employees. The rest will trickle down, I promise.